Every modern digital system is fighting an invisible war over trust. Attackers don't just look for software bugs. They go after the trust relationships that hold PKI together, the keys, the certificates, and the authorities we implicitly rely on. In this module, we'll look at how those trust links become threat vectors, why a single weak relationship can undermine an entire environment, and how design choices can either amplify or contain the damage. Think of PKI as critical infrastructure. When it fails, outages, impersonation, and data breaches follow. Our goal is to understand these risks clearly, then learn how to build PKI that is resilient by design, not just secure on paper. When we talk about PKI, we're really talking about building a chain of trust. At the top sits a root certificate authority that everyone agrees to trust by default. That root delegates its power to one or more intermediate authorities, and those intermediates finally issue certificates to servers, users, or devices. Each step in that chain is a promise. The root promises the intermediate is legitimate, and the intermediate promises the end certificate really represents that identity. If any one of those promises is broken, because a root key is stolen, an intermediate misissues a certificate, or a client fails to validate properly, the whole chain becomes unreliable. So PKI security is not just about strong cryptography. It's about making sure every link in this trust chain is tightly controlled, well audited, and correctly validated. Otherwise, everything that depends on it is at risk. Man-in-the-middle attacks are the core problem PKI is trying to solve. Imagine a client and a server trying to talk securely. If an attacker can sit in the middle, they can create one encrypted connection to the client and a separate encrypted connection to the server, and quietly relay or modify everything. Both sides think they're secure, but they're actually just encrypted to the attacker. PKI breaks this attack by binding a public key to an identity through a certificate that's signed by a trusted authority. When the client connects, it doesn't just accept any key it sees. It checks that the certificate is valid, correctly signed, not expired, and issued to the expected server name. If any of those checks fail, the client should assume it's talking to an imposter and stop the connection. When those checks succeed, the attacker can still see the traffic passing by, but without the private key that matches the trusted certificate, they can't decrypt or alter it. The critical catch is that PKI only protects you if the client is configured to trust the right certificate authorities and refuses to trust fakes or misissued certificates. To understand why we need PKI at all, it helps to see how easy it is to cheat the network and DNS. Think of the network as the road, and DNS as the map that tells you where a website lives. If an attacker controls either one, they can quietly redirect you. Your browser may say bank, but you're actually talking to the attacker's server. They can read, change, or record everything you send. Routers can be compromised. DNS answers can be poisoned or spoofed. None of that is visible to a normal user. From their perspectives, the connection just works. This is the core trust problem PKI is designed to solve. We can't trust the path or the map by default. So we need a way to verify the identity of the system at the other end, even when the road and the map might be hostile. PKI gives us that independent layer of trust, above the network, that attackers can't easily fake. PKI only works if we actually verify what we're presented with. Think of cryptography as the lock and key, or an invalidation as the guard who checks the key. If the guard is missing or ignores warnings, the whole design collapses. In digital terms, that means we must check whether a certificate is expired, self-signed when it shouldn't be, issued to the wrong name, or revoked. Systems that skip hostname checks, accept any certificate, or disable validation for testing are effectively propping the gate open. Many real outages and breaches come from this exact failure. The math was fine, but nobody enforced the rules. As you think about PKI design, keep asking, where is validation happening? Who owns it? And what stops someone from bypassing it? So far, we've treated certificate authorities as the trusted judges of the internet. A rogue CA is what happens when that judge is corrupted. If an attacker steals or abuses a CA's private key, they can issue perfectly valid-looking certificates for any site they choose. Browsers and operating systems will accept those certificates because from their perspective, the chain of trust is intact and signed by a known CA. This is what makes rogue keys so dangerous. They turn all the usual defenses, padlocks, HTTPS indicators, even certificate pinning in some cases, into a liability, because users feel safe while talking directly to an attacker. For architects and leaders, the lesson is that PKI risk is not just out there with end entity keys. The CA key is a systemic single point of failure. Protecting it with strong governance, HSMs, audits, and rapid revocation processes is critical, because if the judge is compromised, the entire courtroom's decisions become suspect. By now you know that PKI itself is usually not what breaks. It's the processes around it. A good example is how attackers abuse domain validation to get real certificates for fake or stolen identities. In the normal flow, a certificate authority checks that you really control a domain, often through DNS records or email challenges. If you respond correctly, you get a certificate, and browsers will happily trust it. Attackers look for gaps in that validation flow. Maybe they intercept the validation email, poison DNS, exploit a misconfigured proxy, or abuse an automation bug. They don't crack the cryptography. They trick the CA into believing they own the domain. Once they have a legitimate certificate, they can run convincing phishing sites, perform man-in-the-middle attacks, or impersonate services, all while showing a valid lock icon to users. The takeaway is that strong crypto is not enough. The identity proofing and validation steps around PKI must be tightly designed, monitored, and audited, or you end up issuing real IDs to the wrong people. PKI gives you the padlock, but it does not guarantee humans read the address correctly. Typo squatting and homoglyphs exploit that gap. Attackers register domains that look almost identical to a real brand, change a single character, and then get a perfectly valid certificate for that fake name. Because the browser only checks, does this certificate match this domain? The padlock still shows. Technically, everything is fine. From the user's perspective, though, they think they're on the genuine site, and will happily enter passwords or card details. Homoglyph attacks go one step further, by using characters from other alphabets that visually mimic normal letters. To most people, the URL looks perfect, but it actually points to a completely different domain. The key point is, PKI proves you reach the owner of that exact string of characters, not that the string represents the brand you had in mind. In modern infrastructures, you need additional controls, like brand monitoring, DNS defenses, and user education, to close this human vision gap in the trust model. At this point, you already know that cryptography is built on hard math. But that math only stays hard if the randomness behind it is truly unpredictable. Entropy is just a formal word for how much uncertainty there is in the random values we use to generate keys, nonces, and tokens. With strong entropy, every key is like rolling a huge bucket of dice. The outcome is chaotic, and even with massive computing power, an attacker can't feasibly guess the value. With weak entropy, you're rolling just a few dice, and they're almost always landing on the same numbers. The space of possible keys shrinks dramatically, which makes brute force and dictionary attacks suddenly practical. The critical idea is, predictable input equals guessable keys. It doesn't matter how long the key is, or how modern the algorithm looks. If the randomness comes from a low-quality source, the entire PKI can be compromised. This is why secure random number generators, good seeding, And avoiding shortcuts like timestamps or user IDs as randomness are non-negotiable in any serious cryptographic system. You've seen how powerful modern cryptographic algorithms are. But history keeps reminding us that they are only as strong as their randomness. When randomness fails, completely valid algorithms collapse. In one famous incident, a change in a common crypto library drastically reduced the random space. Keys that should have been unique became guessable, and attackers could pre-compute huge lists of private keys. Something similar happened in many early embedded and IoT devices. They generated keys during the very first boot, before the system had collected enough entropy. Millions of devices ended up sharing keys, or using values that were trivial to predict. We see the same pattern with digital signatures. If the random value used in a signing operation is reused or predictable, an attacker can often recover the private key from just a few signatures. So for PKI, the message is clear. Choosing RSA or ECDSA is not the hard part. Ensuring high-quality randomness, correct seeding, and careful implementation is what actually protects your certificates and keys. Strong math cannot compensate for weak engineering. Let's connect entropy to real-world risk. In a healthy PKI system, private keys are generated with high-quality randomness. That gives you an enormous search space, so a brute force search would take longer than the age of the universe. Attackers don't even try. But if your random number generator is weak or predictable, that search space collapses. Instead of needing to search all possible keys, an attacker can focus on a tiny subset that your system is likely to produce. They can pre-compute those likely keys in advance and store them in what is effectively a skeleton key database. Then, whenever they see a certificate or encrypted message from your environment, they just look up which weak key fits, instead of breaking modern cryptography. The lesson is simple but critical. Strong algorithms are not enough. If your entropy source is flawed, PKE trust can be silently bypassed, and every certificate issued with those keys becomes suspect. Defense in depth for PKI means we stop relying on hope and start stacking protections across hardware, policy, and the network. At the base, hardware protects the keys themselves. That's where HSM's secure boot and strong random number generation live. If an attacker can't extract or predict your keys, they're forced to move up the stack. The next layer is policy. This is where governance becomes a security control. Strict issuance rules, well-designed private keys, defined key lifetimes, and auditable processes. Even if someone has access to systems, they shouldn't be able to mint arbitrary certificates or bypass approvals. At the top, the network enforces how certificates are actually used. Techniques like certificate pinning, certificate transparency logs, HSTS, TLS termination controls, and web firewalls catch misuse, misissuance, and many man-in-the-middle attempts. The key idea is resilience through redundancy. Assume any single layer can fail. When hardware, policy, and network controls reinforce each other, PKE becomes much harder to subvert and much easier to govern at enterprise scale. Once you've designed a PKI, the real challenge is keeping it trustworthy over time. That depends on 3 habits: knowing what you have, reacting quickly when something goes wrong, and watching the ecosystem around you. First, inventory. You need automated discovery of every certificate and key in your environment: public, private, test, shadow IT. If you can't see it, you can't renew it, rotate it, or revoke it before it causes an outage or a breach. Manual spreadsheets simply don't keep up with modern, dynamic infrastructure. Second, revocation speed. Compromised or misissued certificates must be killed fast. That means OCSP or similar mechanisms that are highly available, low latency, and integrated with your incident response playbooks. Your goal is to shrink the window between "we have a problem" and relying parties stop trusting that cert. Third, transparency. Don't just trust that CAs behave. Verify. Continuously monitor certificate transparency logs and other telemetry to spot unexpected certificates for your domains, strange issuers, or unusual patterns. Treat PKI logs like security logs, feed them into CM, add alerts, and review anomalies. The big idea is that security here is not a one-time PKI deployment. It's an operational process of continuous discovery, continuous revocation readiness, and continuous monitoring of the broader trust landscape. By now, you've seen that PKI is everywhere in your digital infrastructure. The real challenge is not deploying some certificates, but securing the foundations that all other controls depend on. Think of trust as being held up by a few critical pillars. First, trust verification. Every relying system must be able to check who issued a certificate, whether the chain is valid, and whether it's been revoked. If verification is weak or inconsistent, attackers can slip in forged or misused certificates. Second, strict validation. That means enforcing key sizes, algorithms, name constraints, and lifetimes that match your policy, instead of blindly accepting whatever a CA hands you. Most real-world PKI failures come from relaxed validation logic, not from broken math. Third, strong entropy and key protection. If your randomness, key generation, or storage is weak, everything else collapses. This is where HSMs, hardened key management, and careful operational processes become non-negotiable. Finally, governance. Clear policies, roles, audits, and incident playbooks determine how trust is created, changed, and removed over time. Governance is what keeps PKI aligned with zero trust and regulatory requirements as your environment evolves. When you recognize these pillars and design around them, PKI stops being just certificate plumbing and becomes a deliberate, governed trust platform for the entire organization.